My dear brothers and sisters, today Goa is on the boil. People express that they have been hurt, pained by the derogatory remarks of one Gautam Kattar and many others earlier and after. And so we need to understand these conditions in which we are facing, unfortunately, the pain ongoing society. Today, I'd like to talk about the two Francis Xaviers that exist together. There is Saint Francis Xavier, we call him going society, who is post death of that living Francis Xavier, who came from Europe on 7th May 1542 and landed in Goa. And then this Francis, who was so much in love with God and humanity, dies in 10 years on 3rd December 1552. So, in 10 years' time, what did he do so that he becomes a great Goenka Sahib in Goa? So, we need to understand these two sides of the same coin. It is the same Saint Francis Xavier, but in his death, he becomes Goenka Sahib in Goa, while Saint Francis in other places, a great father in Tamil Nadu, where he spent 2 years trying to work with the Paravas. And so we have this great saint who, while he was living through his compassion, service, care, he had won the hearts of Goans and many others in different places where he reached out as a messenger of Jesus Christ. And therefore, while we want to look at the historical side of Saint Francis Xavier, we need to also look at what happens post his death and how people in Goa relate to this great saint, and he emerges as a Goenka Sahib in this relationship between Goans and Saint Francis Xavier. So as I was telling you, he comes to Goa on 7th May 1442. And in his first 5 months, he arrives as a papal legate. He was given a royal room next to the viceroy, it is said, but he refused to stay there and stayed in the hospital, taking care of the lepers and the sick, listening to them, hearing their confessions, counseling them. In many ways, he accompanied these sick people while he stayed in a hospital. And in the evenings, they say he would walk down the streets of Old Goa with his bell and gather the children and give them catechism and through them to their parents. So this is the memory we have of him while he was there in Goa for 5 months. Then later he has many journeys, and all his journeys are interrupted by his return to Goa. And if we collect everything and totalize it, it is just 18 months. The longest altogether is given as 18 months. Some even go up to the point of 7 months with 3 visits. But there are many visits that he made, it seems, during that time of 10 years that he spent in the East. So from 1442 to 1552, his visits were very short. They were more administrative. Goa was an administrative hub. It was called the Rome of the East, and he, being the superior of the Jesuits in the East, needed to come back and take stock of things happening and give permissions that are required and many other things. As a papal legate, his presence in Goa was required. It's amazing that many Jesuits wrote back against Francis, saying that he has lost his mind. He is not found in Goa. So his absence was felt by his own colleagues, and they wrote to Ignatius, to his superior, that Francis Xavier has lost his mind, he has lost his spirit. He is not there for us when we want him. He is always on his move. He's always in a mission, he's always somewhere with others, and he was less in Goa, more in other places. And it's amazing, this letter reaches to Ignatius, and Ignatius sends, Saint Ignatius, by the way, sends a letter recalling Francis back to Rome, thinking that Francis really had lost his spirit, the, the kind of spiritual life that he and Francis and his other companions had experienced before they founded the Society of Jesus. And so this was letter reaches the East only after Saint Francis dies. It's interesting. The letter to recall Francis Xavier reaches only after his death. And so, in that sense, God takes him before he could be recalled back. Now, his presence in Goa, absence in Goa, is historically recorded. And therefore, his absence also was felt. And therefore, his work in Goa has been very minimum. But his work in other places has been great. He spent 2 years in Tamil Nadu with the Paravas, the fisherfolk, the people who were sea divers who dived into the sea in search of pearls. And so he spent 2 years staying in a cave. I have visited the cave, and he had the greatest success of his life while he was in Tamil Nadu with the Paravas. The entire community converts. And he writes, "My hands are tired baptizing these people." And so people held his hands while he baptized them all the time. That in one day, in those days, they were all mass baptisms, not like our time when we baptize individuals when they are very small and infants. And so he is man of his times, but same for us, for our times. While we can see great success of Saint Francis, he has been somewhat successful in other places, in the so-called Spice Islands, Malacca, and then even in Japan. He spent 2 years, but that was not so successful, but he tried his best in Japan to communicate his message of Jesus, and tried to win people for Jesus. And yet we can see a great saint who is patient, who is silent, who is experiencing both successes as well as less success. But his urge to go about proclaiming Jesus does not diminish in any way. So he moves from Japan, maybe he returns back to Goa, then gets back ready to go to China, and on the way to China in the island of Sanxia, he dies on 3rd December 1552. So that is the historical Francis Xavier, who later will be proclaimed saint, and that's what we know about him. But one thing is very clear, his work in Goa is not there, and therefore there is a kind of over imagination about Francis, what he did to so-called earlier our forefathers who were baptized, and even other and our kings who were remaining to our original faith traditions. And so in that sense, the earlier Hindus as well as the Christians who suffered under Inquisition. So it's amazing to understand why he was not present. His absence itself is magnified today, and he is being kind of made a villain. It's important that history can teach us a lot of lessons, and so let's do something more. Let's dwell deeper. There are these two Francises, and we need to make a difference. The historical man, Francis who was in love with God and humanity, and there is another Saint Francis who is the same Francis, but his reach has become bigger in terms of what he has become when after his death. And so, while we return back to the historical Francis, let me say that he was a great pastor and not a conqueror. Because there are two important, you know, uh, there are many letters that he has written. All these letters are his intimate messages to his friends. They were private letters. He wrote in privacy of his own, uh, maybe person, and sent those letters to his friends in Europe. When he became saint, they were put together, they were studied, and they were compiled into a book. I myself have gone through many of his letters. Uh, they are very edifying, very deeply telling us what he was and what kind of relationship he had with Jesus, with the church, and with others. And so, while we look at this closely, I wanted to look at two letters that he wrote. One, most probably from Goa, because when he arrived in Goa and his 5 months in Goa, he was not very happy with what he saw in Goa. He saw the Christians, the Europeans, the Portuguese Fidalgos. He also saw the soldiers, and their moral life disturbed him. And so he writes a letter to the King John III about the moral life of this so-called, you know, the Fidalgos as well as the soldiers. And they were not really living Christians virtue, but they were very celebrative of Christian celebrations, feasts, and things of this kind, which are very external. And deeply, he found that they are wanting when it comes to Christian life. And so he writes to the king to bring more regulations to how they can live Christian lives when they are away from Portugal. This is one letter. So it shows the heart of a pastor. It doesn't seem to say, I want to conquer all these Goans who are there. His whole heart was moving towards this white Europeans who were with him, who were not living as Christians. That is the first response we can find from Francis. The second, as a pastor, I must say, comes also while he was in Malaccas, where in a so-called a fort, he writes a letter. He writes a so-called the very famous 1546, the letter in Malacca to ask, writing to the same king, John III, asking him to institute or establish so-called Inquisition in Goa. Now this letter is very public, it is there, and in that letter his heart is very, very pastoral. It is not a kind of a conqueror, missionary, or want to convert some people. It was about the Portuguese would use two words, Novos Cristãos and Cristãos da Terra. Novos Cristãos, the new Christians were the Jews and the so-called Muslims who were Christians, but previously they were Jews. So Inquisition was basically looking at Christians if they are not faithful to their own faith. Now in this case, Christians who practiced Christianity externally but privately, secretly went back to perhaps Jewish faith, perhaps Islamic faith. That is what was happening on that island. And so he writes this letter asking for inquisition for these guys who are crypto Jews, crypto Mohammedans. He uses the terms very clearly. There are no names, other people, not even us, Cristãos da Terra, the native Christians. In his mind, at least, he did not have any intention for Christians of the local place, like later we will become Christians and so many others of Goa and other places. But when he writes, it is not Cristãos da Terra, it is Novos Cristãos, the new Christians. And therefore the new Christians is a technical word which meant the Jews who became Christians, and it also meant Islamic followers who became Christians. So, in his mind, at least, it was only Christians who were to be subjected to Inquisition, nobody else. So that way, that is also a heart of a pastor, not not a conqueror. So that is where we have to come to understand these letters can expose a very deep personal love that he had for everybody and for God. And so while we see a pastor in him, we can also see when he comes, when he finishes his campaign, perhaps in his death, when he reaches his climax, he became bigger than what he was in his life. Because you see, as a person coming from a royal family from Spain, they could not take his body back to Spain. In our days, anybody dies anywhere in the world, we fly them back to our houses, to our villages, to our places. In those days, there were no flights, there were boats, and the speed of the boat from Japan to reach Portugal, or from China, from Malaysia, from India, quite a long time. India took almost a year. He took 1 year to come to India. And so, in that sense, if you look at it closely, what they would do, they would bury the person and take the remainings, like his her bones, back to the place, to their family. Everybody needs a closure after a painful loss of a person. In death, we do need closures, and for that reason, today we bring the body, have funerals, bury, and all these rituals we practice, put flowers, meet each other. So, this way, in those days, they would carry the bones to their families, and that was their main important task after Francis unfortunately dies on the way to China on that island. So he was buried, and he was buried in a with limestone so that his body decomposes faster, because that was a transit island, and the seamen wanted to go back to from to I think it was Malacca, so they want to come back to Malacca, and so that's what happens. They find the body fresh, and therefore they come back with the body and take it and bury it again in Malacca. We still have that famous grave in Malacca, and so that is where Francis' body was actually buried. And so we find the body was vandalized in many ways without people knowing. Nobody thought he was a saint. Nobody imagined that it was a miracle. And so in that, these things do happen through a slow process. We realize in Goa that he has been a great holy person and he is a saint. So it was a journey even after his death to come to where he was. Now we have to prove that his body has been fresh, not corrupted in death, and therefore the hand was cut. And this hand is taken to Rome and given to the Pope and shown to the Pope, and that's how it was proved. Even today we have his hand in Rome. And so, my dear friends, see this journey of this Francis, who was a simple, ordinary man, becomes big when he experiences death. And so he becomes saint, and his body is then housed in born Jesus. And that's where we come, meet him, have feasts, and pray. From our intimacy, we come and relate to him with our hopes, fears, and many other intimate things that we relate to him. And we don't know when he was called going to side. And therefore, this going to side is the same Saint Francis Xavier, but at the same time, he's not the same. So, this is the paradox, how he leaps into a big status and stature through the relationship that people of Goa have with this simple, ordinary Father Francis Xavier. And so this is one in death. Once he becomes saint, and once people experience deep relationship, which maybe people experience miracles, people experience their prayers being heard over centuries. It is not today or yesterday. It has happened over a long period of time. And that is the reason there are things on both sides. People who come to Francis perhaps pray with him. They are very happy to come, pray, meet him, meet there, kneel down, or do all kinds of rituals that are give him some. Suppose my hand is sick, I give a wax hand to him. This is what I've seen. A leg is sick, so you give a wax leg. Like that, people do their rituals and so offerings that they do, and people in turn get healings and perhaps whatever return they get from what they do. So therefore, Francis has become larger and bigger in his death, not so much in his life. And particularly in Goa, his presence was minimum, his absence was bigger, and yet his presence post death in Goa had made him bigger than what he was in his life in Goa and even elsewhere. And with this affectionate title, going to side, there are many things that remain hidden for us, like that simple man who did not have access to our own languages. There was language barrier, the food barrier. He ate some kind of food and all kinds of foods. Perhaps food was put on his table. He had many issues, long travels, fatigue, tiredness, exhaustion of these journeys and things of this nature. And we do not even consider those things. We think he's a great saint and everything just goes smooth for him. It was not the case. So, therefore, when we imagine someone as big as he and make him a bigger halo around him in our own little or simple ways, uh, sometimes we miss few things. We miss the struggles that Saint Francis went through in his life. As I would tell you, his own companions were not with him. They wrote back to his, their superior general, and who then believed his own other companions, and he was recalled. So therefore, Francis did not enjoy a very smooth sailing life. At the same time, post death also, there is a lot of distortion as we find also today, the way he was insulted and all that. But there are also academical studies, particularly one study on the title of that book, The Goa Inquisition. And so the Goa Inquisition was a book which has a which which has a A.K. Priolka's 1961 book, which unfortunately links Inquisition to many things which Inquisition was not supposed to do. But see, Inquisition is not supposed had no jurisdiction over breaking down the temples, or Inquisition had no jurisdiction over post conversions and things like that. Inquisition is post conversion. Whoever is converted, or at the most who blocks conversion, can be brought under Inquisition. Not really this. So there were other authorities, other. This doesn't mean that temples were not broken. This doesn't mean there were kind of conversions or whatever. I don't disown or condone. See, but mixing up things when they are complex makes things a little, insincere. So, and St. Francis Xavier's hands were not so much into this. And the Inquisition that he asked for those Jews and so-called Muslims who acted or pretended to be Christians, uh, did not come because he asked for. It comes 8 years after his death. And that's why, so there is this linking of Inquisition to issues beyond the jurisdiction and scope and powers of Inquisition becomes a little complicated and has been revisited by scholars, and this book has been questioned and critiqued mostly by Portuguese scholars, and unfortunately, Portuguese themselves destroyed the most of the documents of Inquisition, though they were very well documented and written. There are some few cases which are still there, and through that we can easily understand Inquisition was not directed against any other than Christian. So it was Christian who suffered, and so that, for that reason, mixing up issues makes it a little difficult. So that's why I was trying to say, when he became bigger, we lost some of his real struggles of life. Some of us imagined more than what he was really. He had no powers over the military, he had no powers over people who would go and destroy temples. He had nothing of this kind. He was rather more simple. So my talk today is around the history and the post history of Francis. So where we have also the myth we have as who are liking Francis Xavier, who have been his devotees and who have find him in inspiration. We have lost his struggles, we have lost his pain, we have lost so many other things about as a human person he went through. And maybe even us and others who are imagining larger than life image of his think that he can just push one button and entire things will happen and the army will go down and destroy them. It was not as simple as this. And therefore, and his presence in Goa and his absence in Goa, all that tries to tell us that Francis was as ordinary as you and me. He is the man of his times, but certainly he is a saint for our times. That's the reason I wanted to bring these two Francises, not with anything to as an apology or to fight somebody else, but for us to understand that we have these two Francises and we are working with these two Francises in all of us in when we relate to Francis, and sometimes we have given myth a little more space than reality and real historical Francis. And so, for that reason, to recover the historical Francis without losing what we have made out of him as going society was the real goal of what I was trying to say. So, I thank everybody who have been following this little talk of mine. I hope it enlightens all of us that we can discern the two Francises without dividing them, without separating them. They are inseparable. The Francis of history and Francis post death is the same person. It's like the two sides of the same coin. And we who now have this privilege of making this discernment and putting it together might be able to relate to Francis more clearly and more intimately, and also we might be able to understand what is happening around us while Francis of history and Francis of our faith or Francis of our devotion, uh, they are now fused together, and sometimes we look at one part and think that is entire Francis. So we cannot take the piece of the cake and say it is the whole cake. So that's why, as I try to conclude this few words that I wanted to bring to all of us, that will, as fragile as we are, Francis himself was. And therefore, but he had that great love for God and humanity. And so this is what can bring the best out of us. And that's what God can do. We do as Francis himself believed and others. Please excuse me for calling him Francis because in spontaneity I cannot always call him Saint Francis. So that said, see, all of us are fragile. Grace works on nature. This is what Saint Francis would believe, Saint Ignatius would believe, uh, Jesuits believe. Grace works on nature. And so we give ourselves the best opportunity for God to work with us. When we try to give our talents, when we try to give our best, God will work the rest. And so that way, to find God in everything, to be able to see God in everything and see God in people and see God in cultures, that is what Francis was talking about. And that's why we cannot simply look at him as a conqueror, as one who come to annihilate cultures and destroy. He saw God in everything. That was the basic principle. And God works, grace works on nature, not from, grace is not coming from out, but it's from our nature. So these are two basic principles on which the Jesuits, even today and before, have been really relating in their work and lives. So let's look at Francis from this angle and see how the two Francises can merge in our own life and we can understand what happens and condone people. I would like to say, not condone, I would like to say all of us need to be peaceful, calm, and maybe the government authorities, and let the law take its own course and allow, peace and calmness to rule us in our most intimate and deep persons, so that we are able to respond the way Francis Xavier and way Jesus Christ would have responded to such controversies that we are facing in our troubled times. Thank you.